So we're going to talk about goal setting today and using goal setting as an effective organizational intervention and organizational development. Before we move on, though, I want to briefly talk about the theory of planned behavior, and that's the model that I have on the slide right now. And the theory of planned behavior is a great way to remind us that we have a tendency to believe that attitudes have a direct relationship with behavior. We know very much our own attitudes and how we believe and how we feel. And there is a common fallacy, if you will, that attitudes lead directly to behavior. So if you know someone's attitudes, if you know their thoughts and their feelings and their beliefs, that you'll automatically be able to detect how they're going to behave. And therefore, a lot of layman attempts to change behavior in organizations tends to focus a lot on changing attitudes. If we can get everyone to have a positive attitude, everyone's going to get this done. If we have everyone agree that safety is important, then safety is going to increase. The problem with this is that attitudes are important, but they're one part of a larger model. That if we're really trying to get at a behavior, attitudes are at least two steps removed and are actually about equally as important as two other major factors. And that's the idea behind the theory for planned behavior, is that to really get a behavior to change, that we have a few things we have to really look at. The first one is attitude. So kind of the psychological joke has always been, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And it doesn't matter the number, the light bulb wants to change. I probably didn't tell that joke very well. But the idea is still there that we do want to make sure that people have a positive attitude towards what's happening in an organization. So if someone is open to change, if someone thinks change is a good idea, if someone can see the reason that behaviors are needed to be changed in the organization, it is going to be easier to see those behaviors actually occur. And likewise, if someone has a very negative attitude towards change, is very resistant to change, doesn't see the reason for it, and actually is even offended by it, they're going to be less likely to make those changes. However, that's not the entire picture. The next one is subjective norms. So subjective norms basically means is the environment itself supporting or refuting those attitudes. So again, we'll use the same example. I have a person that is very positive in their attitudes of like, we need to change our behaviors in this organization. The behaviors we're currently doing are not getting us to our goals. We need to change how we do things, and I strongly believe that. But I'm the only one. Everyone else in the organization, the norms of the organization is everything's fine. Everyone else believes that there shouldn't be change, that there doesn't need to be change, and are against that change. Those subjective norms are going to be very hard for my attitude alone to now push new behaviors, because I'm going to be actively going against the group norms, and in many ways I'm going to be basically making myself an outsider. Likewise, we can flip that around. I have a negative attitude towards change. I don't see any reason for it. I don't want to do it, but I also recognize I'm the only one. Everyone else is wanting to see this change. Everyone else is looking at me like, why am I being the negative Nelly in this situation? And in that case, those subjective norms may well overpower my attitude. So generally speaking, we do find that people are looking at how other people are behaving to determine their own behaviors. So the subjective norms are important as well. And finally, you can have an organization where everyone has a positive attitude towards change. So everyone has that attitude component. They want to see change. The subjective norms are everyone agrees we need to see change. Let's get things done. But the change that needs to be done is something beyond the skills and abilities of the people in the organization to actually implement. And that's the perceived behavior control. And I would also say that there's a real behavioral control component. Do the people actually have either the ability within the organization to do the change or the skill sets necessary to do the change? You need all three of these, ideally, to really guarantee the likelihood of a behavioral change sticking in an organization. So when we're looking at organizational interventions such as goal setting, one of the things we want to think about is this theory of planned behavior model and ask, is our intervention focusing on individual attitudes to convince people the change in behavior is necessary? Are we also doing it in such a way that we're making sure that the norms of the organization are supporting those attitudes? And that can often be managerial support, that can be cultural support, that can be memos from the top. And finally, are we giving the people that we want to change who we are wanting to change their behavior the resources, the latitude, the ability to actually do that change, perceived behavioral control? And do they see that? Do they believe it? Perception is often reality. So when you have all three of these aligned, you're going to find that even then, it does not immediately result in behavior. It usually results in kind of a mid-step that we call the intention to change that behavior. Now, intentions themselves can now be derailed by multiple components. And the next model we're going to look at is actually a goal-setting model. And you're going to see a lot of the similar kind of concepts in that model of the various steps it takes to actually see a behavioral change. So this is the most common model for goal setting in organizations. And again, we have the idea that we're driving a goal. And we're going to kind of take apart each one of these components throughout the slide set. But the first thing to note, and you're going to hear me say this multiple times, is that when we set goals, goals need to be specific and relatively difficult. So by specific, they need to be objective, they need to be measurable, they need to be something that someone can see their progress towards. So a goal of better performance, that's not a specific goal. A goal of a 10% increase in sales, that's a specific measurable goal. And it needs to be difficult. So if you set a goal of, we want to see you sell one more contract in the next month, when pretty much the company norm is people are getting 5 to 6 new contracts every month anyway. That goal is going to be easily met, but it's also not going to drive any change in behavior because it doesn't have to. A difficult goal is your normal increase per month is a 3 new contracts. We want to see 5. That might be a moderately difficult goal. Now, the important thing here is that if it's too difficult, we want to see you double that number. We're also going to see that goal not function. So goals work best when they're specific, objectively measurable, and relatively difficult. They're going to require some effort, some change in behavior, but a change in behavior that is possible. So once you set a specific and difficult goal, there's 2 steps in the goal setting model. That first is the commitment to achieving the goal. So how do we increase the likelihood of committing to actually getting the goal done? And there's a few things here. The more that the person actually is involved in setting the goal, in other words, not a manager saying you have to double production, but a manager saying, what do you think is a reasonable but moderately difficult goal for your current position in the next month? The individual has internal focus of control, so we do find that some people actually tend to blame the environment on what happens to them, and some people have more of an internal focus of control. People with an internal focus of control basically take responsibility for their own actions, tend to also respond better to goals. And the more public the goals are, the more other people know about them. So if you secretly think to yourself, I'm going to lose some weight, that goal is not public. It is easy for you to decide later, yeah, but I'd really like to have that cupcake. If you tell everyone you know, I'm going to start dieting and eating better, when you eat that cupcake in front of friends, it's clearly very visual that you're now not serving your own goals. We also need to make sure that that goal is accepted. And the accepted box is basically, again, participation in setting the goal is one of the big ones here. So we set a specific and difficult goal. We've made sure it's been committed to by the person being involved in setting the goals, but also making sure that they're recognizing their own abilities. Now, that internal focus of control is similar to that perceived behavioral control. It's convincing someone or empowering someone that they have the ability to make this change, and that goal is public, and they were involved in the decision making. Now we have motivation occurring. So the next box as we move on is basically similar in the previous slide to that intention box. We now have someone that's like, okay, I'm motivated. I've accepted this goal. I'm going to work towards this goal. I want to get it done. There's still a few areas that can kind of derail that intention. So in this model, at the bottom, we have national culture. And national culture can involve individual cultural differences. So does the person actually have a tendency to have a high kind of work motivation or not? But it can also be the culture of the organization itself. It can also be those subjective norms that are basically encouraging or discouraging motivation to work towards a goal. We can also find individual differences at this point, so self-efficacy, which is basically kind of an individual personality variable that determines how capable you are and how much you believe in that capacity. So again, assuming that motivation process moves forward, now we actually start to do the behavioral changes. Self-generated feedback on this progress is basically looking to see, are the behaviors I'm trying actually resulting in me getting closer to that measurable goal? And the idea here is to actually get behaviors that result in higher performance, which is that goal achievement. So goal setting theory, generally speaking, goal setting can be organizational wide, department wide, individual, or an integration of all three. So an organizational wide goal can be broad goals. Now again, if possible, they should be as specific and measurable as possible on any of these levels, and they should also be relatively difficult. Individual goals is where they see the goal setting theory used the most because it's pretty easy to visualize how to walk through that model with an individual as a manager to move towards those goals. But the same model works on both departmental, group, team, and organizational wide goal setting. And again, a lot of organizations may have multiple goal setting plans in place at once: organizational wide goals, department wide goals, team goals, and individual goals. And a goal is anything an individual is trying to accomplish. It's the object of the actions. It's the reason for the behavioral changes. And again, it works best if it's objectively measurable. And again, by objectively measurable, I mean multiple people can look at the results and come to the same conclusion. So the major findings of goal setting theory, as I was already mentioning, difficult goals produce better performance, and it's kind of an inverted U-shaped relationship. And that means that if there's a very easy goal, you usually don't see much change in behavior and much motivation. If it's a very difficult goal, you usually don't see much change in behavior or motivation. It's at that moderately difficult zone that we actually find behavioral changes and moving towards goals. Specific hard goals are better than do your best. So again, the more that they can be clearly articulated, this is the goal and this is an objective goal and here's how to attain it, the more likely it is going to have an impact on people actually doing behaviors to get to the goal. We do find that if people find that goals are too hard, they may abandon them. And this is an important part for that managerial component, that if you're using goal setting theory, you do need hands-on feedback from managers to people that have taken on goals to check in. Is that difficult goal still a motivating difficult goal, or has it become too easy, which means behaviors have slacked off, performance has slacked off, or has that goal become too hard? It really was an unrealistically hard goal, and the person is now starting to realize it, which means, again, we're going to see a reduction in movement towards the goal, but also in behaviors to get production up or productivity up. And participation increases commitment to goals. So these are the main findings of all the research that's been done on goal setting on how to actually use goals more successfully in organizations. And that participation refers to the more the person is involved in setting their own goals, the more the person is involved in setting the actual behaviors and strategies to attain that goal, and the more that person is participating in feedback on how well they're getting towards their goals, the more likely they are to be committed to those goals, and the more likely they are to be committed, the more likely we're going to see behavioral changes and, again, movement towards those goals. Continuing the major findings of the research on goal setting theory, feedback about the accomplishment improves performance. So the more there is check-ins, if you will, from supervisors to direct reports about the success of the behaviors towards getting the goals attained, and also occasionally possibly even adjusting the goals to make sure that they are still motivating, the more likely we're going to see improvements in performance. We have found that education and position in the organization tends not to predict success. So if you're trying to predict who's going to be successful at attaining a goal, the factors we've been talking about, making sure that it's an objective goal, making sure that it's relatively difficult, making sure there's a good feedback process, basically maintaining the level of difficulty, and giving the person feedback on how their behaviors have been getting to the goal, those are the better predictors. Finding someone with a higher level of education, finding someone that's higher level in the organization, and assuming that they're going to respond better to goal setting theories than other people, not a lot of support. I should note that goal setting in teams deserves special consideration, so there's a fair amount of research specifically targeting how you use goal setting theory in teams. And the biggest problem with this, or issue that you have to be aware of, and we talked about this a little bit in team development, is that when you develop a team, you need to make sure that tasks are interdependent. In other words, that everyone has to help each other in order for that goal to be attained. So when we apply goal setting theory to team, the big thing to remember, that special consideration, is we can't just treat it as if you have a team of 5 people, 5 individual goals. We need to create a team goal, but that team goal needs to not only be moderately difficult, not only needs to be objective and measurable, it also needs to be an interdependent goal that the team will have to work together to be able to attain. And you need to add that extra level to make sure goal setting works. Without that extra level, it tends to actually, you don't see a lot of increase in performance within teams if you're just focusing on individual goals within a team. And research has found that supportive management is critical to the success of goal setting. So a lot of organizations like to just implement a goal setting theory kind of plan, and they start setting goals with people, but they don't support that setting. And what I mean by the supportive management, think about the models we've already talked about. There's important components of making sure that people are participating in the setting of goals. That requires management interaction. There is the subjective norms, or the norms of the organization, the culture of the organization. Well, that's often communicated by management. And finally, there's the kind of fine-tuning of, is the behaviors getting the person towards the goal? What are the plans they're doing? What are the actual behaviors they're changing to get to those goals? And is it working? That feedback, again, that needs to come from management. So if you remove the support of management, setting goals is going to be much less likely to actually be successful. So the goal setting model, putting it all together, again, difficult and specific goals are developed. Commitment to the goal is achieved by mutual trust in the upper management, and that can be obtained through both the culture of the organization, past experiences of knowing that management is actually there to help the employee and not necessarily to hinder or be political towards the employee, support by management, which we've already been going over, and care given to competition between employees and teams. And that's that's the component I'm going to talk about a little bit here, because all these other components I've already pretty much talked about. We do need to make sure that when we're setting goals, because we're trying to set difficult goals but obtainable goals, a difficult obtainable goal may be different for different employees. So special care does need to be given to potential competition between employees and also potential backlash from the employees when they find out, for example, that someone in the same job title as them have a lesser goal than they do currently. So it really does, again, this goes back to the support of management and trust. Managers need to make sure that they are communicating properly. You know, this is an individual goal that we're setting together. And because we're setting this goal together, you're challenging yourself. That means that it may be different than other goals set by other people. Just recognize that we recognize challenging goals that are obtained are worthy of praise within this system. We can overcome resistance to goals by providing special training if required. And again, I'm going to go back to that very first model of the theory of planned behavior, that one of the most important components is, does the person think they have the ability to attain the goal? So one of the ways we can overcome resistance to a goal is making sure that people are trained in the required behaviors we're asking them to do. We want to make sure there's an effective reward and incentive system. And this is kind of a little bit of a difficulty, because you'll notice that I didn't talk about rewards or incentives in any of the original models. So we're kind of moving to a separate theory of just kind of behavioral control. We typically find that if we want to increase a particular behavior, so a behavior that will lead towards a goal, one of the ways we can do this is by attaching very specific rewards or incentive systems. In other words, we want to make sure people are being rewarded for obtaining these goals, for planning these goals, for seeing value in this goal-setting process. And again, I keep coming back to this one, participation by employees in setting the goals. If goals are being set, difficult, objective goals are being set by management with no participation by individual employees in what those goals are, it's going to be a lot harder to see that goal-setting model actually work and result in change in behavior. So we also want to recognize that in those models, we have a feedback area that a lot of the work is at the start of the model. So if we look at the theory of planned behavior, that very first slide, we had attitudes, subjective norms, perceived behavioral control, and intentions. All of that happens before the actual behaviors that are intended to get us to our goals. Likewise, in the goal setting model on slide 2, we had and a whole bunch of stuff about accepting the goals, basically committing to the goals, having motivation. All of that occurs before the behaviors actually occur. Once behaviors are occurring, that's a period of performance when management support and feedback is given. So now we have to actually look, are these behaviors, these plans that we've come up with the employee as a supervisor, actually resulting in them moving towards their goals? And do we need to give feedback of, well, maybe you need to increase these behaviors, maybe these behaviors aren't working, let's try something else. Recognize that within goal setting theory, one of the important parts I talked about was managerial support, and part of managerial support is recognizing that employees may occasionally require additional resources to attain goals. These can be financial resources, these can be access to additional skill sets of other employees. This can also just be more time given towards getting towards those goals. Whatever it takes, that's again up to the manager to be able to determine, do I need to provide these additional resources to make sure that the goals are met? And managers and employees definitely need to interact to develop action plans. Notice that if you really think about everything I'm talking about, we are talking about an intervention that involves managers becoming much more directly involved in supporting employees, and the employees are the ones that are actually trying to develop the goals, develop the action plans with the manager's help and the manager's oversight and feedback. So we are creating very integrative teams, if you will, between managers and their direct supports. And if that managerial support isn't there, if managers aren't providing timely and objective feedback that's helping the employees manage their behavioral changes to get to the goals, we're going to see this is going to be a lot less effective. So the final kind of big model of goal setting is we establish goals, we achieve commitment, and we overcome resistance. And that results in people actually taking on the goals. Once those goals are taken on, we enter into a period of performance, and then that period of performance, the change in behaviors, will hopefully result in actually attaining the goal. And the managerial part of this is establishing the goals through participation with the employee, helping to achieve that commitment, getting people to buy into the goals, accept them, and to overcome resistance, both by changing the culture and the norms, and also making sure the person has the perceived skills and control over their own behaviors to adopt those goals. If we do that, the goal itself will be adopted, and the period of performance is then the manager and the direct reports coming up with action plans, coming up with actual behavioral changes necessary, and providing that feedback of, is the goal being obtained through the current set of behaviors?